The first time the medbay sirens howled for a Level 7 containment protocol, the alien medical staff of the Coalition Research Vessel Tenacity assumed a microbial breach or perhaps the accidental exposure of a volatile compound. A Level 7 implied immediate lockdown, full hazard suits, and the kind of tension that made even the most hardened trauma specialists sweat through their membranes. What they did not expect, what none of them could have expected, was the arrival of a human. More specifically, the arrival of a human carrying a creature that, according to the data feed scrolling on the terminal, had triggered the security system by merely yawning. "Everyone stand back," Nurse Galek shouted, pushing through the corridor with a containment net so overbuilt it could have held a compressed star. The other medics, 5 in total, representing 4 species, pressed against the bulkhead, as wide as the human stepped into view. He was tall, though not unusually so, with dark hair, a slight limp, and a calmness that clashed violently with the blaring alarms. In his arms, nestled against his chest, was the source of the panic, a creature covered in thick gray fur, limbs relaxed, eyes half-lidded. All right, turn that off," the human shouted over the siren. "You're gonna give him a heart attack." Galek ignored him, pointing a scanner toward the creature. "That is a Class 9 Apex lifeform. It has not been registered with the Interstellar Pet Registry. It contains over 400 pounds of pure muscle and is capable of rending a Growlithe hull with its jaw strength. You brought this aboard? Without clearance." The human blinked. "His name's Dozer. He just wants treats and naps." "You're lying." "Nope." Galek took a step forward. Dozer lifted his head, sniffed the air, then licked the human's chin before flopping back down, snoring audibly. "Unconvinced," Galek muttered, motioning for the tranquilizer unit. The human stepped back. "You shoot him with anything, and I swear I will sue your entire galaxy." Dr. Velen, a blue-skinned Tharnakian with 4 eyes and the patience of a glacier, finally arrived, pushing past the crowd. "What is the meaning of this, Mr. Pellan Markley?" "Human Sciences Division. I'm the new zoological liaison." Velen's upper eyes narrowed. "That was not scheduled for another 3 cycles. Yeah, well, I caught the early transport. Got tired of the bureaucracy and figured I'd come introduce Dozer in person. You brought a terrestrial apex predator into a coalition vessel without containment, without warning, and without an interpreter interface? He's not a predator." Pellan adjusted Dozer's weight and winced. "He's a rescue." "He had a rough start, but he's the biggest marshmallow on 4 paws." Dozer snorted again and let out a low groan, which caused 2 nearby staffers to flee into the corridor. Velen stared at the creature, then at Pellan. "I am invoking emergency medical command. The creature must be sedated and quarantined for analysis. You want to try putting him in a cage? Be my guest." Velen turned to the tranquilizer unit. "Proceed." The unit raised its injector arm, approached Dozer, and fired. Nothing happened. Dozer opened one eye, looked at the injector sticking from his flank, and let out a low, annoyed whine. Then he sneezed. The injector flew across the room and embedded itself in a metal wall panel. Son of a Pellan hoisted Dozer and stumbled back into the corridor. "He's allergic to synthetic tranquilizers." "You just made him itchy." The medic stared in horror as Dozer squirmed in Pellan's arms, trying to scratch the injection site with a back leg the size of a hoverbike. "Get him to containment," Galek shouted. "No." Pellan spun around. "Containment's sterile. He needs a soft surface. A blanket. Maybe some jerky." "Jerky?" Velen asked, aghast. "Meat strips. For snacking. Look, can we just go to the bio-quarters? He's not dangerous unless you're a squirrel made of peanut butter." "Or a hull wall," muttered Galek. Velen sighed. "If he damages any part of this vessel, you will be personally responsible." "Noted." They moved as a group, flanked by guards with stun rifles, all aimed at the peacefully drooling creature in Pellan's arms. When they reached the bio-quarters, Pellan set Dozer down onto a padded cot. The creature snuggled into the blanket and within seconds was fast asleep, snoring. The medics waited in tense silence. Pellan turned to them. "See? Treats. Naps. That's all he wants." Later that cycle, after the alarms had been silenced and the guards dismissed, Pellan sat in the observation lounge with Velen and a few of the remaining medical staff. A pot of bitter alien tea steamed on the table between them, and Dozer lay sprawled at Pellan's feet, his tail thumping every few seconds. "You named him Dozer," Velen said slowly, "because he sleeps a lot. And once he starts, you can't move him." And what is his species designation? Canine. Specifically, a breed called Mastiff. He was bred for protection, but mostly he's just a cuddle machine. Galek leaned forward. He has a bite force of over 3,000 psi. Only if you're threatening someone he loves. Otherwise, he'll just stare at you until you give him a belly rub. Pellan set his tea down. We scanned him earlier. His musculature is denser than any other terrestrial creature we've encountered. His heart rate is absurdly low. His body temperature is dangerously high compared to most species aboard the ship. And yet, he does nothing. Exactly. Then why is he so terrifying? Because your scanners don't show intent, Pellan said. They show capability. Sure, he could tear through a wall, but he won't. He's loyal. He's lazy. He has no ambition for destruction. Galek looked unconvinced. And if someone attacks you? Dozer's ear twitched. Pellan answered carefully. Then he won't be lazy. 3 cycles later, the Tenacity was rerouted to assist with a damaged cargo vessel near the edge of the Trelvan expanse. The crew on board had suffered multiple injuries, and the medbay filled quickly with patients, both conscious and unconscious. Pellan volunteered to assist. Though not a medic, he had field training and a calm demeanor that helped during triage. Dozer stayed in the observation room, as instructed. But during the 3rd hour of treatment, a scream echoed through the bay. One of the injured in Athari named Welk had gone into convulsions. He knocked over 2 medics, slammed into a wall, and began thrashing violently. A chemical imbalance had triggered a seizure, but the alien's natural strength made him a danger to everyone nearby. Pellan shouted for restraints. Pellan ducked as an oxygen canister flew past his head. Then the door opened. Dozer padded in, slow and deliberate. His ears perked. His eyes locked on the chaos. Dozer, no stay. Pellan yelled. Dozer ignored him. He walked straight to Welk, who swung a flailing arm in his direction. Dozer dodged, stepped in, and very gently placed both front paws on the Othri's chest. Welk stopped thrashing. Dozer lowered his head and made a low humming sound in his throat. The Athari blinked, then went limp. Pellan blinked all 4 eyes. What did he just do? Pellan stepped forward. Pressure therapy. He does that when I have a panic attack. Panic attack? Humans get overwhelmed sometimes. He's trained to apply pressure to the chest and calm breathing. He calmed an Athari with an apex predator cuddle. Yup, Pellan said, crouching to scratch behind Dozer's ears. Treats. Naps. Occasional emotional support. Pellan looked at the now sleeping Athari, then at Dozer. This ship is going to need a bigger snack budget. The day after the Athari incident, the Tenacity's central corridor outside the med bay was cordoned off with a flimsy caution barrier that had clearly been deployed in haste. A pair of Zakthari engineers were arguing over whether to reroute auxiliary power to reinforce Hatch F7 or install a new sub-sensor grid to monitor biosignature fluctuations. Neither noticed the human hunched on the floor near the wall, elbow deep in a manually disassembled snack dispenser. Right. So if I bypass the internal calorie limiter, Pellan muttered, and swap the protein output for dehydrated lamb. A low huff behind him interrupted his thoughts. Dozer sat, panting lightly, eyes fixed on the partially open dispenser slot where a single nutrition wafer had been hanging for the last 15 minutes, untouched. I know, buddy. It's a disgrace. No seasoning, no aroma, no shame. Dozer drooled slightly. Pellan reached into a pouch at his waist and pulled out a vacuum-sealed strip. Temporary fix. Don't tell anyone. The massive creature leaned forward and accepted the offering with the delicacy of a diplomat exchanging ceremonial gifts. He chewed once, then flopped onto his side, satisfied. You're going to get us both demoted, muttered Pellan. The engineers finally noticed them. Excuse me, human, this corridor is under temporary lockdown, one of them said in clipped trade common. We're working on it, replied Pellan, tapping the data pad on his knee. Your dispenser's denying nutritional variance requests. I've logged 3 complaints already. That device is not authorized for modification. Then you'll have to explain to the Coalition Board why the Tenacity's only Apex-certified comfort animal is being underfed. Dozer let out a deep, guttural sigh that reverberated through the floor. The engineers took a cautious step back. Pellan stood, brushing off his jumpsuit. You want him cranky when the next medical emergency hits? They didn't answer. By the time Pellan and Dozer returned to the med bay, the lighting had dimmed for the vessel's simulated evening cycle. Most of the patients were asleep, and the alien staff were stretched out across their break stations like wilted ferns. A single overhead panel flickered with a quiet electrical complaint. Galek was at the central terminal, eyes scanning rapidly through a series of real-time biometrics. "You're out past curfew," Galek said without looking up. Dozer needed a walk. "You took him to sabotage a Coalition device." "It was a snack machine." "Same principle." Pellan leaned against the counter. "You ever consider that maybe he's the most emotionally stable being on this ship?" Galek tapped a control, bringing up a new chart. "He sheds enough fur to clog an air recycler. That alone is grounds for removal." "I collected it. Made a pillow." The nurse looked up, green eyes narrowing. "You made a pillow. Helps with stress." Galek gestured to a nearby cot. "The Athari you stabilized yesterday? He's been awake for 3 hours. Refuses to talk to anyone but you." Pellan blinked. "That's not standard protocol. Neither is letting a beast lie on our sterile floors, but precedent seems to be dead." He crossed to the cot, where the Athari patient sat upright, legs dangling over the edge, hands folded in his lap. Pale blue skin shimmered under the dim lights, and his eyes tracked Pellan with unsettling stillness. "Hey, Welk?" Pellan kept his tone light. "You gave us a bit of a scare yesterday." "I remember the pressure," Welk said softly. "It was like being pressed into the side of a glacier. But warm. That's Dozer. He's got a sixth sense for distress. I was not distressed. You threw a stool at a wall panel. It was a defensive reflex." Pellan crouched beside the cot. "And the biting? Also defensive." Dozer padded over and sat beside Pellan, tail sweeping the floor once. Welk's posture stiffened. "He won't do anything unless you panic again," Pellan said. "Which, by the way, we'd prefer you didn't." "I dreamed during sedation," Welk said. "I was in a clearing on a low-gravity moon. There were trees, and something large breathing nearby. I thought it was the end. Then you woke up and found out it was just nap time with a furry heat sink." Welk looked at Dozer. "It was. Not unpleasant. High praise." As Pellan stood, the med bay lights flickered again. Galek tapped his comm engineering. "We're experiencing intermittent power drops in med bay sectors 3 through 6. Diagnostic." The voice on the other end crackled. "We're tracking an energy flux from the lower vent shafts. Possibly organic interference." "Organic." Galek's antennae twitched. "Unknown signature. Moving fast." Pellan turned. "Do you have unauthorized fauna aboard?" Galek muted the comm. "Nothing alive should be in the vents." A shriek rang through the corridor outside. Not mechanical, not electronic. Something that ended in a wet, slapping thud. Galek and Pellan exchanged glances. Dozer stood, ears erect. The doors hissed open before anyone could reach them. A technician stumbled in, covered in translucent slime, eyes wide with terror. He collapsed to the floor, gasping. "Something's in the vent system," he rasped. "Big. Fast. Not listed in the manifest." "Where was it heading?" asked Galek. "Mid-deck hydroponics." Pellan reached for his data pad. "That's where the nutrient tanks hook into the environmental system." Galek was already coordinating with security. "Seal off all vent access points. Initiate biohazard suite. Deploy containment drones." Dozer let out a low growl, almost hesitant. Pellan glanced at him. "You smell something?" Dozer turned toward the corridor, nose twitching. "Wait," Pellan said. "If it's fast and moving through vents, drones might not catch it in time. We can't send unarmored personnel after an unknown predator," Galek snapped. "I'm not suggesting sending anyone." Dozer was already trotting toward the door. Galek stepped in front of him. "That creature is not a trained scout." Pellan followed behind. "He's not. But he doesn't chase unless there's a reason. Then I'm going with him." "You'll slow him down." "I'm not letting a fur ball conduct solo recon." Dozer huffed and pushed past both of them. Pellan jogged after him. "Just stay close to the floor, buddy. And don't eat anything unless I say so." They moved through the dim corridors, the overhead lights flickering more frequently now. The air smelled faintly of ozone and compost. A faint scratching echoed from vent to vent. Dozer stopped at an intersection, nose pressed to a grate. Pellan crouched beside him, listening. A skittering noise moved toward them, then paused, then retreated. Pellan tapped his comm. "We've got something active in the ducts near hydroponics. It's tracking us." "Define something," Galek's voice buzzed back. "Smells like mildew and burnt sugar." "Dozer doesn't like it." Dozer growled, deep and slow. Then the grate exploded outward. A blur of limbs and slime launched into the corridor, knocking Pellan backward. Dozer lunged, intercepting the creature mid-air. There was a dull crunch, and the thing hit the floor, writhing. It looked like a cross between a centipede and a deflated balloon, with too many legs and a gaping maw that kept trying to bite things it couldn't reach. Dozer stood over it, unmoving. Pellan sat up, heart pounding. "Okay," he muttered, "that's new." Galek arrived seconds later with 2 security officers. One of them gagged at the sight. "What in the void is that?" Galek asked. Dozer barked once. The creature hissed and went still. Pellan got to his feet. "I'm going to need a containment crate, a flamethrower, and a strong cup of tea." Dozer licked his lips. Galek stared at him. "You didn't feed it to him, did you?" "No," said Pellan. "But I think he wants to know if it pairs well with jerky." Dozer sat, tail wagging once. The corridor reeked of slime and burnt sugar. The hydroponics bay had been scrubbed down, re-sterilized twice, and then sealed behind a triple-lock quarantine panel. There were still faint stains on the floor where the unidentified vent crawler had been subdued, but only those who'd been there could spot them. The rest of the crew were informed it had been a minor biohazard anomaly, which, according to Coalition protocol, could mean anything from fungus to a sentient vapor. Pellan sat on a low bench outside the medbay, Dozer's broad head resting across his boot. He was drowsing with the kind of exhaustion that only came from adrenaline withdrawal and a full body ache. His shirt still smelled faintly of antiseptic and slime, and his datapad kept buzzing with messages from departments he didn't technically report to. "Your creature disobeyed direct command protocol," said Velen, emerging from the hallway with a data slate under one arm. "And unauthorized deployment of a non-diplomatic life form into a containment threat zone is grounds for disciplinary review." Pellan didn't open his eyes. Would a strongly worded thank you note be an acceptable substitute? There is no such clause. Then maybe write one anyway. He's not going to read it. Velen ignored the remark, tapping the slate. "We've completed autopsy on the vent intruder. It was a juvenile gloric, most likely smuggled aboard in a contaminated nutrient shipment. Not native to any registered system. No known intelligence. Aggressive when cornered. Subdermal toxin sacs. Was anyone exposed? 3 technicians received minor dermal irritation. They've been treated. You were covered in biological fluid. It tasted like burnt squash and despair." Velen looked down at Dozer. "And your apex snap beast is immune? He once ate a week-old burrito he found behind a radiator. Nothing affects him. That is not a recognized immunology benchmark. Maybe it should be." Velen's lower eyes blinked in tandem, a Tharnakian sign of reluctant concession. Regardless, despite the irregularity, the situation was contained. Security has rescinded the emergency alert. Pellan finally opened his eyes. "So, no one's trying to jettison him into space today?" "Correct. Though Galek has requisitioned a larger fur filtration system for the med bay." "Progress." Velen turned, but paused. "The Athari patient, Welk. He submitted a formal request for transfer to your department." Pellan sat up straighter. "Wait, what department?" "That's what I asked." Velen walked off without elaborating. By the next day, the vessel's internal tension had settled into its usual simmer. The crew avoided glancing too long at the reinforced snack dispenser, which now sported a hand-etched plaque reading Priority Emotional Support Rations. No one openly acknowledged it, but none of the engineers removed it either. Inside the medbay, Pellan stood at the central console with a blank chart pulled up. Galek was off-duty, and the temporary shift lead, a wiry Frenchman named Jassa, had little patience for anything outside statistical medicine. "You're not a clinician," she said, watching him from the far end of the room. "You have no clearance to edit patient profiles." "I'm not editing. I'm compiling stress indicators for cross-species behavioral mapping. That's not a medbay function." "It is now." She hissed through her gill folds. "On whose authority?" "Mine," said Velen, stepping through the door without ceremony. He handed Pellan a newly minted access badge. "As of this morning, you're assigned to interdisciplinary behavioral stabilization. Temporary status, pending review." Jassa made a noise like a boiling kettle. Pellan examined the badge. "This is laminated. Do not mistake legitimacy for permanence." Dozer was curled under a console, twitching in his sleep. When the door opened again, he lifted his head lazily, nose twitching. A new arrival stepped through. Thin, tall, with mottled amber skin and a narrow face. She wore a translator collar and a boarding tag still attached to her belt. Her eyes were the color of old copper. "Intake from the cargo vessel," Velen said. "Name is Lyra." Species, Vainari. Limited familiarity with humans. She experienced acute sensory collapse after her ship's power cycle failed during warp. Pellan approached, holding out a hand. You're safe now. Med systems are stable. Lyra tilted her head, uncertain. You smell like mammalian adrenaline. That's not inaccurate. She looked past him, locking eyes with Dozer. He blinked. She took a step back. Is that part of your medical staff? Pellan crouched beside the massive canine. He's what we use when conventional treatments fall short. You allow apex predators in surgical environments? He's cleaner than most of the crew. And less bitey. Lyra held her arms close. My people don't do well with intense emotional proximity. We absorb it. Dozer stood, stretched once, and patted silently over. Lyra froze. He sat in front of her, tail still. She stared at him. Then, very gently, he leaned forward and rested his chin against her knee. Everyone waited. Lyra didn't move. Her breathing slowed. Her eyes stopped darting. After a long moment, she said, He's very quiet. He usually is. He's not thinking in linear concepts. Nope. He's humming. Low-frequency comfort resonance. We think he learned it from an old refrigerator. She blinked slowly. That's absurd. Welcome to humans. Later, after Lyra had been settled into a low-stim recovery room and Jasa had stormed off muttering about unauthorized therapy animals, Velen joined Pellan in the observation lounge. The stars outside crawled past in slow arcs, and the ship's internal temperature had been lowered by a single degree, just enough to make the tea taste pleasant. Your creature has now calmed an Authari, subdued a wild Gloric, and prevented a Vainari emotional collapse, Velen said, not looking up from his cup. Don't forget convincing an engineer to reprogram the snack dispenser. I choose not to acknowledge that. Dozer was sprawled across 3 cushions, paws twitching. You could have reassigned me the moment I stepped out of line, Pellan said. Why didn't you? Velen took a slow sip. Because the crew are sleeping more soundly. Because the med staff's stress output has decreased by 12%. And because, for reasons I cannot explain, I now receive daily reports on Dozer's bowel schedule from 6 different departments. Pellan winced. I told them that was optional. No one listens to you, Pellan. They listen to him. Dozer let out a soft snore, his tail thumping once against the floor. You'll need to draft a formal proposal, Velen added. If this continues, the Coalition will demand documentation. I'll write it tonight. And you'll need to get him certified. He hates paperwork. You'll fill it out. Pellan nodded slowly. Dozer, buddy. You're officially employed. The big canine didn't stir. Outside, the stars wheeled on, and somewhere deep in the ship, the snack dispenser chirped softly as it dispensed its first ever lamb-flavored treat.